G'day and welcome to another episode of Cuppa with a Jesuit. I'm Father Robin Koning, the Vocations Director for the Australian Jesuit Province.
With Father Robin, I'm Julian Butler, a Jesuit in formation and training for priesthood, and we're joined today by Father Paul Fyfe. Father Paul, welcome.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be with you.
Paul, would you begin by telling us a little bit about the ministry that you're currently involved in, the work you're doing at the moment?
Yes, just at the moment, the majority of my work is a strange one. It's in a nursing, no, not a nursing. It's an aged care home, a new one where another Jesuit, older Jesuit, is resident, and we're just helping out there for a while. And my job as a chaplain then is fitting in with a couple of pastoral care workers, and between us, we take care of about 120 residents, and I also have some responsibility for an adjoining facility, which is palliative care. So I get called in quite often to do end of life or other similar things for those people who are soon to die. But most of the people I'm working with are very much alive. So sometimes not quite all there, but that's fun, you know.
And Paul, alongside that chaplaincy work, you also have something of a role in the province around care for the environment and ecological issues. Could you share a bit about that side of that passion for you, really, as I understand?
Yeah, this is something that's sort of grown over time. My interest was always in science. The reason why I joined the society really came out of that. And early on in my studies, I realised that before I did university, I realised that the way the world was going was moving much away from physics, maths and chemistry, which were the things that I was really strong at, particularly chem, and moving towards the biological sciences. So perhaps not entirely wisely, but I made that when I went to university. I made that shift intending to focus on biochemistry and genetics, which are the two major things that I did in my degree, and that was extraordinary opening up that was going on in the mid-70s. By the time it got to the 90s, I, having taught chemistry in the meantime, that's in Adelaide, and kept up my reading in science. So I tried to read as much as I could in science during my time, particularly earlier in the society. The issues that had been a small part of what my interest was initially gained a lot. So it was my interest in promoting the society to take a role in that. Obviously, with the very large number of universities we have around the world, with the significant impact that we can have within the Catholic Church itself, then it seemed to me that the Jesuits should take a leading role in that sort of thing. And so naturally, I then took as much interest as I could in it while I was doing quite different work at the time. So that's where it began. Certainly, I became rather disillusioned with the way in which the world was going, and it was an enormous fillip to my interest and to my concern when Pope Francis came along and published that extraordinary encyclical Laudato Si, which while assumed to be about ecology and things like that, it's actually a very profound work on human life in general. It covers the whole gamut, and he then, not quite in that encyclical, but in a talk that he gave, I think possibly the one to the US government when he visited the US just after he released that encyclical, he actually went the full hog, I would say, in saying that creation has a value in and of itself without us, and that that certainly wasn't the sort of ethics that I had been taught, but it rubbed against the fact that you had to believe somehow or other that we've been hanging around for, the universe had been hanging around for 13 billion years just waiting for us to come along so that we could give praise to God. And when I had been rereading scripture and with that thought and to my great surprise, I found an enormous amount of stuff in Scripture. So I felt like I wasn't going outside of anything that the church should be interested in, and it was wonderful when the Pope actually came out and made that statement for the first time. Certainly Pope Benedict XVI had laid the groundwork for that, being described when he was coming off as Pope as the Green Pope, and everyone's forgotten that, I think, but he certainly deserved that epithet.
Paul, I suppose you talked about an encyclical that covers the gamut in human life. Jesuit kind of ministry can do something similar in a way, and to move from ecology to another, I suppose, passion of yours and gift that you've brought to ministry is preparing people for marriage. Some 300 couples, I think, through intensive kind of programs of marriage preparation. Would you tell us about how that began as a particular ministry for you, and how you've brought yourself into that work?
That's actually a very good question, and it's one that I answer when I first interview a couple. Why do I bother doing weddings? And it seemed to me when I was beginning as a priest that first of all, was the church teaching about marriage? You know, Jesus said the two will become one body, and what God has joined we must not divide. And we don't take everything that Jesus says word for word and apply it. And so were we justified in that? That was an issue for me, and one that I resolved. Some religions allow people to remarry under certain conditions, and Christian religions, and so was our process for that, was that fair, and so forth. So these things were the first of all, to me, in some ways a barrier for taking what back in those days seemed to be a large responsibility, because large numbers of weddings were breaking up. So I didn't want to be taking couples through a whole process and then find them going out the back door a few years later. And by good fortune, fantastic canon lawyer and priest that helped us form us for priesthood, he saw this new thing that was being introduced, and he invited us, divided the ordination class, you know, whether we wanted to go. And so I went along, and so I learned how to do prepare, and which is it's not the whole deal, but it's a very important part. And there are things that I've learnt from doing that, and it means that I spend usually at least 6 sessions with couples, and I make sure that they're willing to do that before I get too deeply involved, because you don't want to be preparing people for about 3 sessions and then they decide that this is not really what they want to do. Yeah, so that's how I got involved in it. The other important thing, though, was that it was statistically found that one of the very important things in marriages was the first couple of years. And so as I was starting and realised that was another factor apart from preparation, I resolved that I will keep in touch with couples. And so, yes, I do. I have married close to, well, no, I haven't. 300 couples have married themselves with my help and with myself as celebrant or co-celebrant or whatever. And a number of others have been married by have had the celebrant as another person. But I've kept all those that I've been engaged when I've kept in touch with for over the past nearly 40 years. I find it a very life-giving work too. I mean, I don't do it just because I have to as a priest, and bishops keep saying, would somebody please not turn people away? But I actually, as long as they're prepared, and almost all are, to go through the sort of terrible thing that I put them through, so I get a lot of life from that, and I always thank them at the end, truly, because I find, although in a rare cases it sometimes is taxing and very difficult, but by and large, most of the time I find that as a sacrament is just very life-giving for me, and sacraments have always been part of the key to my approach to God.
Well, can we go back to your own vocation journey, and what was it that led you towards joining the Jesuits initially?
Yes, I probably hinted at that a little bit already, but I was always interested in becoming, I went to a Marist school and I was always interested in becoming a brother or a priest. By the year 9, I'd figured I'd be a lousy teacher, which I later proved. So I switched my ideas for the last few years at school to being a priest. And I knew a lot of great priests, wonderful priests. But when I found out how they got formed, how they got trained to be that, I just wasn't impressed. And so by midway during year 12, I was signed up to go and do science at Adelaide University after finishing school. But a priest had come from India for one reason or another, and he happened to be a mate of my principal, and so my principal thought that we were the worst year 12 class ever to go through school, and he didn't know who he'd get. But anyway, this guy volunteered to do it, and he was wonderful. My semi-atheist mates even thought he was wonderful as well. But yet again, I had a number of priests like that, and so I just waltzed up to him and said, "So how did you do this? How did you become like this?" And he started telling me about Jesuits who were working in astronomy and engineering and all of this, and I thought, wow. And so, well, what process do you go through? Or do you go to university? And then I thought, okay, that's one of the basic things I was looking for. But at the heart of it, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to him was because, having gone through a fairly, in some ways, shallow formation, not that we didn't know a lot, but spiritually shallow from my point of view, a lot of Marian devotion, but not much else. And this was a person who brought Christ alive. And together with what he said about what Jesuits do, could find Christ in everything around. And I had already articulated for myself, and sometimes talking with others, that was the sort of Catholicism that I was interested in being part of. And suddenly I found a way of doing it. And then I found out that you had to get through because at that stage, everyone was leaving the church the priesthood in droves. And I thought, basically, you knock on the door and they'd say, "Thank God somebody wants to join us." And then I found out I had to go through all sorts of psychological tests and that. Anyway, I must have faked that enough to get through. But the central thing, though, was still in the first year, the retreat that we went through, which is a long retreat, mainly in silence. And I can remember having a conversation with another bloke from Adelaide I joined with, and we were just talking about that a week or so later, and just how much that had deepened and resonated, what our reasons were for joining this mob in the first place. Christ.
So, Paul, if you were talking to a young man today who was interested in religious life, maybe interested in the Society of Jesus, what would you say to him?
Well, I mean, I've talked to a number of people in that situation, and just as I happen to be I happen to meet the right person, you encourage them to talk to Jesuits, because we're a pretty diverse mob, and as we find God in all things, that's part of the vocation. So if that's what interests the person, if he can have particularly to sort of sound out and see if he's got an interest in issues of justice, and I certainly did. Went through the Young Christian Students movement when I was at school, and so yeah, if those are the sort of things that tick boxes for him, but to meet Jesuits, to meet young Jesuits, like well, you're not exactly young, Julian, but you you do great work with young people, and to talk to people and to develop their spiritual life, with a bit of advice from other Jesuits. That's the advice I'd give them, and say, like, I've found it a wonderful life. It will always have its challenges, and sometimes, like every life, we're blessed in the Australian province. I mean, we've got people who are shaping the Australian church in very profound ways. in areas of justice, in areas of spirituality, of influencing the bishops and so forth, not because we've gone out of our way to do it, but because people have seen in a number of Australian Jesuits the sort of thing that attracted me in the first place. So yeah, so there's definitely something there worth exploring, find out more.
Paul, thank you very much for those encouraging words and for sharing your own journey and your own passion for different elements of ministry during your life. It's been great talking to you. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Paul.
God bless.